October 20th, 1944. Red Beach, Leyte. The surf hissed over coral and mangrove root as ramps clanged down and the first wave splashed ashore. Cameras found General Douglas MacArthur mid-stride, hat high, jaw set, a tableau staged for history and for the men stacked shoulder to shoulder behind him. Beyond the famous shot, the battle's real opening move was quieter and uglier. Survey stakes, bulldozers, reels of wire, and pallets of pierced steel planking, PSP, craned onto a sucking, rain-swollen island that smelled of wet iron and sap. Leyte would be won by runways as much as by rifles. By noon, Tacloban's strip, barely a ribbon hammered flat between jungle and sea, was taking traffic it could not bear. Liaison cubs skipped in on one wheel and hopped aside. C-47s sighed down heavy with radios and rations. B-25s snatched gaps between squalls, and over the foam of propwash came the long-legged silhouettes the 5th Air Force had bet the campaign on. Twin-tailed P-38 Lightnings, first in singles, then in wary pairs, then in entire flights that wheeled above the one usable runway like gulls arguing over a pier. Steel mats clanked under truck tires. Engineers threw down one more bay of PSP and waved in another landing. Build, fuel, fly, in that order, or lose the beach. The Japanese understood perfectly well what a dry strip meant. Raids came thin at first, then thicker, squadrons lifting from Luzon and the Visayas to jab at the beachhead and at the plank and mud aerodromes that were metastasizing along the coast. The same afternoon MacArthur waded ashore. Japanese commanders were already queuing waves south. Within days, First Air Fleet under Onishi would hurl serial strikes at American carriers and fields to keep Leyte's sky contested long enough for reinforcements to slip into Ormoc Bay. The air felt busy even when it was empty, the sense that anything not nailed down could suddenly be moving fast and hostile. Dulag, an airstrip the Japanese had hacked from cane fields in 1943, changed flags and purpose in a week. Seabees widened the runway, shouldered PSP across bog, and cut taxiways into the green. Revetments grew like gills along the edges, coral berms, sandbags, palm trunks spiked together to hold fighters that dripped rain and avgas. Tacloban remained a funnel. Dulag became the relief valve. The plan was obvious even to a private on a shovel. Split the traffic, shorten the pattern, get more lightnings airborne than the weather could kill. Into this choreography came Major Thomas Buchanan McGuire, Jr., wiry, intense, a restless metronome of motion from briefing hut to revetment and back again. The 431st Fighter Squadron's tactical brain had already boiled a year of combat into a handbook for the theatre. Altitude is money, speed is how you spend it. A two-ship is a promise you keep with your life. On Leyte he found a campaign that would test every line he'd written. Wet steel and low ceilings punish even good doctrine. The books said boom and zoom. The clouds said show me. The 475th Fighter Group began arriving in waves, their story already bonded to the P-38s. Long legs, hard punch, and a knack for bringing men home on one engine and a prayer. On November 1st, 431st pilots ferried Lightnings into Tacloban to help cover the chaos. The controller looked up at a sky scabbed with cloud and told them to stay high and patrol because the deck was jammed and a raid might be forming. McGuire promptly carved his 25th victory out of that dirty air. The next day, with the air echelon forward, the group's rhythm changed. Scramble from Dulag when Tacloban flooded, stack over the one dry ribbon when Dulag disappeared under a squall, fight the island and the enemy and the schedule all at once. Fuel was the grammar of everything. A P-38 drank roughly 100 gallons an hour in the climb and far more when both throttles were firewalled in combat. Drums rolled off LSTs and into shaded dumps where hoses snaked toward tankers and hand pumps. Crew chiefs counted sorties as carefully as pilots counted seconds of trigger time. The island's equation was brutally simple: Convert tanker tonnage into fighter hours faster than the enemy could convert Ormoc convoys into battalions. The 5th Air Force had learned this arithmetic in New Guinea. Leyte demanded it under worse rain and closer fire. Enemy doctrine favoured the island's traps. Ki-43s and Ki-84s rose through torn cloud, snapped into sharp, flat turns, and dared the heavier lightnings to follow. McGuire's answer, drilled into kids whose boots were still new, was geometry and patience, 4 ship integrity, altitude bands, 2-second bursts at 300 yards, and a refusal to be baited into the green. Hit hard once, climb twice, reset, he'd say, fingertip making invisible circles over a wet map. Above Tacloban, that advice wasn't a lecture, it was an air traffic solution. You did not want free-form dogfighting over a single soggy strip with transports short final and bombers go-arounding into your blind spot. You wanted order, you wanted pairs, you wanted home. Order came hard on November's worst day, when 5 units tried to land and launch through the same ragged ceiling while a Japanese probe threaded the gaps. The runway pumped like a sprung board under the weight of Avengers, Mitchells and Lightnings. Ground guides windmilled arms to swing fighters into revetments as another element rolled. A P-38's wheels kissed PSP, bounced, then bit. The pilot held it low to bleed speed, then kicked hard right to clear the centerline for a C-47 whose approach lights were 2 streaks of water in the rain. Somewhere in that mess, McGuire's voice on the radio stayed maddeningly even. Altitudes assigned, elements paired, a merge called and then dismissed when the raid broke, the kind of calm that makes discipline contagious. The stakes on the ground were as stark as the ones in the air. If Tacloban and Dulag held, if fuel flowed forward and revetments stayed just above the waterline, Ormoc Bay could be made into a daylight killing ground. If they didn't, the Japanese TA convoys threading down from Manila under nasty weather and night cover would arrive with fighters overhead and teeth bared. In the first week, both futures felt possible. Then the sortie count climbed, the patrol lines thickened, and the sky began to tilt. P-38s ranged farther. Raids that had chased transports at anchor found top cover waiting at the right altitude with the sun in the right place. Ships smoking in Ormoc at noon meant fewer shells on the Tacloban road by dusk. The ledger started to lean our way. At dusk, Tacloban smelled of burned cordite and damp canvas. In a lean-to mess, a chaplain read a line about deliverance while an armourer thumbed de-linked .50 caliber into an ammo can for dawn. On a grease-darkened workbench, someone scraped coral grit from a turbo regulator and called it Leyte snow. In the revetment, a crew chief leaned both palms on the P-38's leading edge and felt, absurdly, that the aluminum was warmer than the air. "Tomorrow," he said to nobody, "we lay one more row of steel, and maybe the rain skips us for an hour." The pilot, whose name was stenciled below the canopy, ducked under the wing, eyes already up. "An hour's enough," he said. And if the weather gave it, they would buy it with every drum they had and spend it over Ormoc in 2-second bursts that sounded, even through cloud and tropical rain, like a free world hammering. The first week after MacArthur's boots hit Leyte's sand was a battle for runways and revetments. The second was a battle for the sea lanes. For Tokyo, the only way to contest Leyte was to drip men and machines through the throat of Ormoc Bay. For the 5th Air Force, and for Thomas McGuire's 431st Fighter Squadron, the job was to slam that throat shut with every gallon of avgas and every round of .50 caliber they could drag forward. On October 24th, Imperial General Headquarters ordered a succession of transport convoys, TA operations, to reinforce Leyte by night. Destroyers packed with soldiers, barges lashed together and covered with palm, even requisitioned merchantmen, all staggered south from Manila. They would hug coastlines, dart through squalls, and thread into Ormoc Bay under cover of weather. Japanese diaries captured after the war reveal the desperation. If we cannot land at Ormoc, Leyte is lost. We accept losses if half the men reach shore. McGuire, now a major but still restless as a second lieutenant in his heart, studied the maps with a pencil tapping on Ormoc's narrow inlet. The convoys had to come here. The mountain ridges funneled them like a gun barrel. "This," he told his squadron, "is where the war's throat is." But to choke Ormoc, you first had to claw your way off Leyte's mud. October bled into November in a cycle of dawn thunderheads and noontime downpours that left Tacloban's PSP slick as ice. Fighters queued on taxiways so narrow that a single ground loop could block the field for hours. Pilots sat strapped in, sweating under parachute harnesses, waiting for the signal to roll while Seabees hammered at buckling steel panels only yards away. The 431st's Lightnings idled in revetments that stank of wet avgas and red clay. Crew chiefs cursed as rainwater beaded on ammo belts. To McGuire, the real fight was against minutes lost. Every squall that grounded Tacloban gave the Japanese one more chance to push barges into Ormoc unmolested. November 10th, 1944. Radio chatter spiked as a convoy was sighted threading south under destroyer escort. The scramble was ragged, fighters slaloming between lumbering transports still inbound with fuel drums. But by noon, McGuire had 4 flights clawing into broken sky. The strike was textbook 5th Air Force, B-25 strafers down on the deck, A-20s behind them with parafrags, and P-38s riding high to cover. As the lightnings slashed through cloud gaps, they found the convoy already under attack. McGuire rolled inverted, dropped his nose, and led his section into a steep dive. His wingman, Captain Jack Rittmeyer, later recalled, "It was like diving into a furnace." The bay was solid with tracers, but Major Mac had us disciplined. 1 pass, guns on, climb out. They stitched a transport end to end, 8 Brownings pounding until the deck erupted in smoke and spray. Pulling out, McGuire saw soldiers leaping into water already black with oil. He called his men back into pairs, climbed through flak bursts, and turned for another pass. The Japanese response was immediate. Ki-43s swept in from the west, darting through the mountains. Their gamble was simple: lure the heavy P-38s into twisting fights where nimble Oscars held the edge. But McGuire's years of drilling paid off. His 431st held formation, refused the bait, and used altitude like a club. 4 up, 2 down, climb, reset. The voice over the radio was calm, unhurried. McGuire personally flamed 1 Ki-43 with a deflection shot that cut the fighter in 2. His men scored 5 more. Not one P-38 was lost that day. Ormoc Bay was littered with wreckage by evening, smoking hulls, lifeboats overturned, men clinging to crates. The Japanese convoy commanders knew the math. Every reinforcement run now meant losing half or more of the force before they touched sand. Back at Tacloban, the victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. Pilots taxied in over warped steel, climbed out soaked with sweat and rain, and handed control locks to crew chiefs who had slept 3 hours in as many days. Seabees kept laying steel by lantern light. Fuel drums kept rolling off LSTs. Letters home capture the texture. One 431st pilot wrote, "We live ankle-deep in mud. You sit in the cockpit, smell of avgas, rain pelting the canopy, waiting for the ground controller to clear you. Then you fly an hour, fight 10 minutes, and fly an hour home. The Japanese are dangerous, but the weather is worse." McGuire shared their fatigue, but not their doubt. His notebooks filled with diagrams, angles of attack, altitudes to hold, fuel figures scribbled between sortie counts. Every dogfight replayed at night on paper so it would be cleaner the next time. Strategically, Leyte was more than an island. It was a fulcrum. If Ormoc convoys could be stopped, Japanese ground forces would wither in pockets. If they got through, the landing would be choked in its cradle. The Navy's carriers had moved east to intercept Kurita's fleet. The Army Air Forces were left to fight the convoys and the skies. Reports from the 13th Fighter Command told the story in numbers. 12 convoys attempted, most broken apart before landing. Hundreds of barges destroyed, thousands of troops lost at sea. But every week a few got through, enough to keep the fight around Leyte's ridges bitter. McGuire knew the campaign was not decided by a single intercept, but by relentless arithmetic. Deny the enemy more often than not, pile up the deficit until resistance collapsed. What made McGuire unique was not just his marksmanship, but the way his presence steadied chaos. Young pilots, some with less than 200 hours in fighters, followed him into squalls that erased horizon lines and into formations where tracers seemed to knit a solid wall. His commands were clipped, mathematical, almost impersonal, yet they carried the weight of certainty. One lieutenant wrote after the war, "When Mac was in the lead, you believed you would come home." He was thin as a fence post, always chewing his lip, but when he called a vector you turned without question. He flew with a map in his head. By late November, the battle for Ormoc was grinding both sides down. The Japanese had lost most of their escorts. Barges now crept by night alone. The 431st was flying 2, sometimes 3 sorties daily, chasing convoys, burning through fuel reserves that arrived only hours before on Liberty ships. The island was an anvil, rain hammering, enemy raids darting, mud sucking at every tire. And yet McGuire and his squadron kept launching, kept splitting the sky into ordered bands of altitude, kept the convoys bleeding. Tacloban's strip gleamed silver in the rain, the sound of rivet guns and turbochargers mingling into one exhausted hymn. For Major Thomas McGuire, Leyte was proving ground and crucible. Marksmanship mattered, but more than that, discipline mattered. Steel underfoot, steel in the air, steel in the will to keep flying when the island itself seemed determined to ground you. The Japanese still came. Ormoc still flickered with explosions at dusk, but the arithmetic was shifting, and in that arithmetic, sorties flown, convoys broken, fuel burned, McGuire's name was becoming central, his presence a hinge in the story of Leyte. Leyte was not just an island to seize, it was an environment determined to grind the invaders down. By December 1944, it seemed the enemy was not only the Japanese but also the island itself. The skies opened every afternoon with tropical violence, a thunderclap, a sheet of water so dense the horizon vanished, and then hours of drumming rain that left the runways buckling under their own weight. At Tacloban, the steel-planked strip bent and warped like tin foil. Each time a P-38 rolled out for takeoff, ground crews held their breath. A misplaced wheel could snag in the seam between pierced steel plates and shear a tire, twisting 14 tons of fighter into a cartwheeling wreck. Major Thomas McGuire walked the line daily, boots squelching in mud, jaw working in concentration. The thin, angular Floridian looked perpetually restless, like his wiry frame could barely contain his drive. In the rain and grease, he was not the legendary ace yet, just a squadron commander fighting to keep airplanes flying from an island determined to ground them. The lightning was both blessing and curse on Leyte. Its twin engines gave pilots confidence on long, overwater hauls. If one engine was hit, the other could drag a wounded aircraft back to Tacloban. But the P-38 also demanded precision. Its turbo superchargers hated moisture. In the tropical soup of Leyte, mechanics worked with blowtorches and tarps to keep condensation from fouling the ducting. When the lightnings did get airborne, they were magnificent. McGuire emphasized discipline. Climb above 20,000 feet, hold formation, fight in pairs, dive with precision, climb back out. No turning contests, no lone wolf heroics. Every sortie was a lesson repeated. Our advantage is altitude and firepower. Protect it. The 431st Squadron began to perfect what pilots called the anvil. One flight hung high, visible bait. Another flight lurked lower in broken clouds, waiting for Japanese fighters to pounce. When they did, the second flight would snap up from below, hammering the attackers between converging guns. The tactic worked. In the first week of December, McGuire's men downed 15 enemy fighters for the loss of 2 Lightnings. Yet success came at a price invisible to war diaries. Pilots were flying 2, sometimes 3 sorties a day. Missions were long, 90 minutes of scanning featureless ocean for barges or circling over supply convoys while thunderstorms boiled up from mountain ridges. The stress showed in eyes hollowed by exhaustion and in hands trembling over mess tins. McGuire himself grew thinner. He ate sparingly, worked endlessly, studied every after-action report as if it held the key to survival. Pilots noticed the strain, but also drew strength from it. One remembered. He looked wired, like electricity ran through him. But when we were in the air, it steadied us. He was thinking 3 moves ahead, even in a storm. The storms made every mission a gamble. Radios failed, compasses spun. More than once, flights returned scattered, aircraft straggling into Tacloban minutes apart, each pilot convinced he was the last survivor. But the squadron endured, bound by McGuire's relentless drilling and his refusal to surrender order to chaos. Despite mounting losses, the Japanese convoys kept coming. November had cost them ships and thousands of men, yet Imperial headquarters ordered more runs. Destroyers, merchantmen, barges lashed together with rope, all braved the gauntlet of Tacloban's Lightnings and Ormoc Bay's gunners. McGuire knew that every barge destroyed in the bay meant fewer rifles on Leyte's ridges. Every convoy that slipped through meant more ambushes for the US infantry clawing toward Ormoc town. "Our job is arithmetic," he told his men. "Add to our totals, subtract from theirs. Do it until nothing's left to subtract." The arithmetic grew brutal. Between November 27th and December 7th, the 475th Fighter Group flew over 200 sorties against convoys. Claims tallied dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. But fatigue deepened and the margin for error narrowed. On December 5th, McGuire led a patrol that ended in near tragedy. They launched into squalls so thick the formation dissolved within minutes. Climbing blind, McGuire nearly collided with his wingman, the slipstream buffeting both fighters into a spiral. Only at 3,000 feet did they regain control, sweating, radios hissing with static. Later that night, he wrote in his notebook, "We cannot fight weather and enemy both. Need stricter criteria for launch. But if we wait, convoys pass. Balance impossible." That balance impossible became the essence of Leyte. Fight in storms and risk accidents. Stay grounded and risk convoys landing. Every decision weighed lives against probabilities. McGuire carried the weight heavily. He was a major, but among his men he felt closer to them than to the brass. He slept in the same damp tents, swatted the same mosquitoes, cursed the same mud. But he also bore the responsibility of holding discipline together. He was not always gentle. Pilots who broke formation heard about it in blistering critiques. Those who ignored orders to climb or hold their wingman found their names stripped from the next mission roster. McGuire believed survival was in habits, not in luck. "Luck runs out," he said more than once. "Drill doesn't." Yet those who endured his sharp tongue trusted him absolutely. They knew his strictness came from calculation, not ego. He was not chasing glory. He was hunting efficiency. By mid-December, the Japanese were committing more fighters to protect Ormoc convoys. Ki-61 Tonys and Ki-84 Franks appeared, tougher machines than the nimble Oscars of earlier months. The duels sharpened. McGuire's P-38s, heavy but fast in dives, clashed with Japanese pilots who knew the islands better and used cloud cover like a weapon. The battles were fierce, sudden, and often decided in seconds. A P-38 could disintegrate a Tony with one accurate burst. A Frank could turn inside a Lightning and cut it to ribbons in a heartbeat. Each engagement tested McGuire's doctrine, discipline over impulse, teamwork over bravado. And still, through the chaos, the arithmetic ground on. Convoys burned, pilots returned bloodied but alive, and McGuire's reputation deepened, not just as a marksman but as the tactical spine of Leyte's air war. By Christmas 1944, Leyte was a battlefield of ghosts. Hills smoked, villages burned, bays shimmered with wreckage. Tacloban's runway, patched 100 times, still gleamed silver under pounding rain. McGuire walked it often, a silhouette against stormlight, his P-38 crouched in its revetment behind him. He knew more was coming. The Japanese were desperate, and desperation made them reckless. He knew also that fatigue was killing his men as surely as bullets. But the campaign was tilting. The convoys were fewer, the reinforcements thinner. The arithmetic was working. In the mud, in the rain, in the roar of twin Allisons clawing skyward, Thomas McGuire was shaping himself into more than a squadron leader. He was becoming the architect of survival, a commander who could hold discipline together when the island itself seemed intent on drowning it. The lightning's thunder, once uncertain in the monsoon, was beginning to dominate Leyte's skies. By late December 1944, the Japanese position on Leyte was collapsing, but the Imperial High Command was unwilling to concede. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had been given overall command of defending the Philippines. His directive was clear: bleed the Americans, delay their advance, and buy time for Japan's shrinking perimeter. Reinforcements streamed toward Leyte in ragged convoys. Some never made it past Mindoro, others were torn apart in Ormoc Bay, but enough arrived to stiffen resistance in the hills. For Yamashita's forces, air cover was dwindling. The once proud Japanese Army Air Force in the Philippines had been shredded. Still, sorties continued, often one-way missions, flown by young pilots with minimal training. In December alone, Tacloban's P-38s recorded over 100 interceptions. Each skirmish added to the mounting pressure on both sides. Major Thomas McGuire approached the new year with sharpened intensity. He was now recognized not only as the 431st Fighter Squadron's commander, but also as 5th Air Force's tactical mind. At 25 aerial victories, he was chasing Richard Bong, his rival and friend, for the title of America's top ace. Yet McGuire seemed less concerned with glory than with proving his theories of air combat. He believed the only path to survival against the increasingly desperate Japanese was absolute formation discipline. His doctrine was rigid: climb together, attack together, disengage together. Break formation, and you're not just risking your life, you're risking your wingman's too. It was not mere theory. In the tangled skies of Leyte, where Japanese fighters hid in clouds and dived from sunbursts, isolation meant death. McGuire's strict adherence to doctrine had saved his squadron in November and December. Now, with Yamashita preparing a counterstroke, the test would become even harsher. The new element in Yamashita's counter-offensive was the kamikaze. What began as isolated suicide strikes in October had hardened into systematic doctrine by December. Young pilots were briefed not on how to return, but how to aim their aircraft into American ships. The first mass kamikaze raids struck Leyte Gulf on December 5th, igniting fuel tanks and sending destroyers to the bottom. For the P-38s of Tacloban and Dulag, this was a nightmare. Their job was no longer just to sweep Japanese fighters from the sky. It was to stop attackers before they could hurl themselves into transports and carriers offshore. Speed and altitude were everything. McGuire adapted quickly. He ordered patrols stacked in layers, high cover at 25,000 feet, mid-cover at 15,000, and a low tripwire near the coast. When radar picked up inbound formations, the lightning would dive through the altitude bands in waves. The tactic turned many kamikaze runs into slaughter, but it also revealed the terrible determination of the Japanese. Some pushed through anyway, skimming waves and slamming into hulls even as their wingmen flamed out around them. January 1945 brought a Japanese counter-offensive across central Luzon, designed to draw American forces north and buy time for retreating garrisons. To cover these operations, Yamashita ordered every available aircraft into the Philippines. Ki-84. Franks, fast and well-armed, began appearing over Luzon and Leyte. They were perhaps the best Japanese fighters of the war, capable of matching American aircraft at most altitudes. McGuire studied intelligence reports carefully. The Frank, he noted, was fragile in dives and less durable than the Lightning. His counter was familiar. Don't turn, don't dogfight, boom and zoom. Hit them in slashing passes, then climb away before they could wheel around. On January 7th, McGuire put this doctrine into action. Leading a formation of P-38s over Ormoc, he intercepted a flight of Franks escorting a convoy. The Lightnings dove from altitude in perfect synchronization, guns blazing. In less than 2 minutes, 5 Franks went down, 2 convoys burned, and the Americans withdrew without a loss. It was a textbook application of his philosophy. Yet the cracks were showing. Not every pilot could resist the temptation to follow a twisting opponent. When one Lightning broke formation, McGuire scolded him publicly, warning, "If you want to dogfight, fly alone. My squadron fights to win, not to die." Even as aerial victories mounted, McGuire knew the campaign depended on logistics. Tacloban's runways were still flooded daily. Convoys of Seabees worked tirelessly to keep pierced steel planking aligned. Aviation fuel was rationed, every barrel tracked. A single Japanese raid that ignited a fuel dump could cripple operations. McGuire made a habit of inspecting supply areas as if they were part of his squadron. He spoke with engineers, checked fuel storage, walked revetments. He understood that without steel under their wheels and gasoline in their tanks, all his tactics were meaningless. The Japanese understood it too. On January 3rd, a surprise raid of Oscars slipped through cloud cover and strafed Tacloban's strip. Fires engulfed 2 Lightnings, but fuel stores held. Had the Oscars ignited them, the entire campaign's air arm might have faltered. McGuire never forgot the sight of fuel drums stacked like fragile monuments beside the runway. The pressure bore down. Pilots noted his increasing restlessness, the way he paced the operations tent at night, reviewing maps by lantern light. He was chasing Bong's record, yes, but more than that, he was fighting his own perfectionism. In letters home, he admitted exhaustion, but insisted on duty. "We're keeping the boys on the ground alive. Every ship we burn in Ormoc Bay, every kamikaze we stop, that's fewer rifles shooting at MacArthur's men. We can't fail them." This sense of responsibility drove him harder than ambition. He began flying every other day, sometimes twice, unwilling to leave victories or risks to anyone else. On January 10th, the 431st intercepted a formation of Ki-43 Oscars near Negros. McGuire, flying lead, downed 2 in quick bursts, raising his tally to 30. But in the melee, one of his wingmen broke off in pursuit of a diving Oscar. McGuire's instinct took over. He wheeled his Lightning to cover him, ignoring his own rule of never sacrificing altitude. It was a glimpse of what lay ahead. For all his doctrine, McGuire's loyalty to his men, and his hunger to protect them, could drive him into the very risks he warned against. His pilots respected him for it, but some wondered if even he could always balance discipline with instinct. By mid-January, the Yamashita counter-offensive was failing. Convoys burned, kamikaze raids cost more Japanese pilots than American ships, and the air over Leyte tilted irreversibly toward Allied dominance. McGuire had become a fixture of this victory, his Lightnings carving arcs through monsoon skies, his tactics blunting Japan's last air strength. But the cost was mounting fatigue, relentless pressure, and the gnawing question of how far one man could push himself and his squadron before the arithmetic of war demanded payment. The stage was set for McGuire's final test, one that would pit his doctrine, his loyalty, and his very instincts against the unforgiving sky. The sun had not yet lifted above the jagged hills of Leyte when Major Thomas B. McGuire strode across the muddy strip at Dulag. It was January 11th, 1945, and 5th Air Force had intelligence of Japanese fighter activity near San Isidro, Negros Island, less than 200 miles away. The mission was simple on paper. 4 P-38s of the 431st Fighter Squadron would sweep ahead of a B-24 strike force and engage any interceptors. McGuire, now with 38 confirmed victories, was already the second highest scoring American ace in the Pacific. Richard Bong had pulled back from combat, ordered stateside as a test pilot. McGuire felt the weight of unfinished business. He carried not just ambition, but also his relentless sense of responsibility to doctrine. At 0700 hours, he briefed his small flight. Captain Edwin Weaver, 34 victories. Lieutenant Douglas Throp, a younger pilot on his first deep penetration. And Captain Jack Rittmeyer, an experienced but cautious flyer. McGuire's instructions were exacting. Maintain formation at all costs, cover your wingmen. No reckless chases. The irony was bitter. Before the day ended, he would break his own rule. The P-38 Lightnings, engines coughing in the humid air, lifted off one by one. Their bellies carried external tanks, 165 gallons each, necessary for the range. Over Leyte Gulf, they formed into a box, climbing slowly to 20,000 feet. Radio chatter was minimal, just the clipped voices of men who had flown together for months. As they crossed into Negros airspace, radar reports confirmed Japanese movement. Fighters from the 201st Air Group based at Cebu were active. Among them were Ki-43 Oscars, light, nimble, and flown by men with nothing to lose. At 10:15 hours, contrails appeared above San Isidro. 8 Oscars, moving in loose formation, began a climbing turn toward the American flight. McGuire's voice crackled. "Keep it tight. Don't get drawn out." The P-38s rolled into combat spread, altitude advantage intact. Weaver opened the fight with a diving burst, flames erupting from an Oscar's wing root. McGuire followed, slicing through with calculated precision, his .50 caliber streams cutting across the sky. One Oscar disintegrated, his 38th kill confirmed. But the Japanese counterattack was furious. 4 Oscars broke upward in a vertical spiral, trying to lure the Lightnings into a turning fight. The others darted low, baiting separation. It was textbook Japanese doctrine, honed from years of attrition. At 10:20 hours, Captain Weaver engaged an Oscar that whipped into a steep climbing right turn. His P-38 followed, engines straining. McGuire, flying just behind, recognized the danger immediately. Weaver was bleeding speed, about to stall under the tighter turning enemy. For all his insistence on discipline, McGuire's instincts overrode calculation. He pulled his Lightning hard into the same climbing turn to cover Weaver's tail. His wingman, Lieutenant Throp, shouted over the radio, "Mac, you're too slow, brake!" It was too late. At 300 feet of altitude, with tanks still mounted, McGuire's P-38 shuddered. The Lightning's broad wings stalled, the nose kicked sideways, and the aircraft rolled sharply left. Witnesses later described it as a sudden snap, the kind of unrecoverable departure P-38 manuals warned about at low speed with auxiliary tanks. The Lightning dropped almost vertically, engines screaming in over-rev. In 3 seconds it smashed into the jungle canopy near Mangaldan, exploding in a ball of fire. There was no parachute, no chance of survival. Weaver, narrowly avoiding the same fate, pulled away, firing a burst that sent the Oscar spinning down. He radioed, voice cracking, "Mac's gone down. Mac's gone down." The battle continued for another 5 minutes. 2 more Oscars were destroyed before the surviving Japanese broke off. When the Lightnings returned to Tacloban, they brought news that stunned the 475th Fighter Group. The man who had preached discipline above all had died trying to save a wingman. Recovery crews reached the crash site later that day. The wreckage lay twisted, buried in the thick vegetation. McGuire's remains were unrecognizable, consumed by the explosion. His dog tags were the only sure marker. He was 24 years old. General George Kenney, commander of 5th Air Force, received the report with visible grief. He had considered McGuire one of the sharpest tactical minds in the theatre. Within days, recommendations went forward for the Medal of Honor, citing his extraordinary gallantry across New Guinea and the Philippines. By the time of his death, McGuire had flown over 400 combat hours and claimed 38 aerial victories, making him the second highest scoring American ace of the war. His 431st Squadron, forged under his doctrine of mutual support, would carry his methods into Luzon and Okinawa. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and ATIS interrogations of Japanese officers confirmed the effectiveness of his tactics. Losses inflicted by the 475th Fighter Group in late 1944 had crippled Japanese air strength on Leyte, paving the way for MacArthur's advance. In the years after, surviving squadron members remembered him not as a rival to Bong, but as a man consumed by both perfection and loyalty. Weaver, who lived until 1991, told interviewers, "Mac broke his own rule that day. He went after that Oscar because he couldn't stand seeing me cornered. He died a hero, but more than that, he died the way he lived, looking after his men." Japanese records, captured in 1946, noted the skirmish tersely. One American twin-engine fighter destroyed near San Isidro. Several losses to enemy fire. For them, it was a minor engagement in a losing war. For the Americans, it was the loss of a legend. At the Tacloban airstrip, McGuire's empty bunk remained untouched for weeks. Pilots spoke in hushed tones, as though acknowledging the absence too loudly would shatter their fragile composure. Above the Pacific skies, new P-38s still thundered, their twin tails glinting in the sun. They carried McGuire's doctrine forward, every wingman watching another's tail, every formation tightened by his memory. The campaign for Leyte had entered its final phase, but for the 431st, January 11th, was more than just another battle. It was the day they lost the man who had taught them how to survive, and who had given his life, proving that no pilot fights alone. When the news of Major Thomas B. McGuire's death spread through the 475th Fighter Group, the airfield at Tacloban fell under a strange quiet. Men who had flown with him across New Guinea and the Philippines walked in silence past his empty bunk, past the P-38 revetments, and past the operations tent where his voice had so often drilled into them the words, "Tight formations, no lone wolf stunts, protect your wingman first." For weeks after January 11th, 1945, his loss was spoken of only in fragments. Younger pilots, men who had idolized him, struggled with the contradiction. McGuire had died breaking the very rule he had made doctrine. Yet those who knew him best, Weaver, Rittmeyer, and others, saw something else. His last act was not recklessness, but loyalty, a refusal to abandon a man under his command. In February 1945, General George Kenney forwarded the paperwork to Washington. The recommendation cited McGuire's record of heroism between August 1943 and January 1945. Over 400 combat hours, 38 confirmed victories, and leadership that had turned the 431st Fighter Squadron into one of the most effective units in the Pacific. On March 25, 1946, in ceremonies held after the war, McGuire was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation emphasized his repeated acts of conspicuous gallantry, often against numerically superior forces, and the ultimate sacrifice he made covering his wingman on Negros Island. The medal joined his Distinguished Service Cross, 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 3 Silver Stars. By decorations alone, McGuire ranked among the most honored pilots of the war. Captured documents from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary painted a sparse but illuminating picture. The January 11th entry listed, "Encounter with 4 enemy twin-engine fighters near San Isidro. 1 enemy downed. 3 of ours destroyed. The understatement reflected both Japanese brevity and the wider collapse of their air forces by early 1945. Post-war interrogations added a human dimension. Lieutenant Hideo Kobayashi, who flew Oscars from Cebu, remembered seeing a large, twin-tailed enemy fighter fall like a stone. He admitted his surprise that the Americans fought so aggressively over Negros when the Japanese could scarcely fuel their aircraft. For the Japanese, McGuire's death was not a triumph, but a footnote in a campaign they were losing by the day. For the Americans, it became a symbol of the cost of victory. McGuire's death inevitably drew comparisons to Richard Bong, America's leading ace with 40 victories. Bong had been pulled back from combat in late 1944 at General Kenny's insistence. Kenny later wrote, "I would not lose both of them. If I had to order one home, it would be Bong, and I hoped Mac would survive the war to take his place." Instead, fate reversed the order. Bong lived long enough to become a test pilot, only to die in August 1945 in the crash of a P-80 jet. The two men, rivals in tally but brothers in spirit, became bookends of America's fighter legacy in the Pacific. Pilots who served under McGuire emphasized his differences. Bong was instinct and intuition, the natural hunter. McGuire was discipline, precision, and doctrine. Together, they represented the dual nature of American air power, individual skill married to systematic training. At reunions in the decades that followed, veterans of the 475th spoke of McGuire with a mixture of pride and lingering grief. In 1985, at the Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, Captain Edwin Weaver stood before a small crowd and recalled that final morning. "Mac told us to keep it tight. He always told us that. And then, when I made the mistake, he came after me. He didn't hesitate. That's who he was. He didn't care about his score, didn't care about the headlines. He cared about his wingmen. If I'm here today, it's because of him." Others remembered his intensity in the ready room, his meticulous study of Japanese tactics, and his insistence on formation discipline. Even those who bristled under his rigidity admitted that his methods saved lives. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater, concluded that American fighter dominance by late 1944 was due less to individual aces than to overwhelming production and training. Yet within that industrial tide, figures like McGuire mattered. His 38 victories were not simply numbers. They reflected hundreds of sorties flown in weather that grounded others, the careful shepherding of bomber formations, and the gradual grinding down of Japanese air strength. Historians such as Daniel Hallman in Killing Yamamoto, 2015, argued that McGuire's doctrine at Leyte was as decisive as any aerial duel. By enforcing tight formations during the most vulnerable weeks after the landings, he ensured that 5th Air Force kept the skies contested, even when Japanese raids peaked at over 100 aircraft a day. McGuire had married Marilyn Wright in 1942 before shipping to the Pacific. She was 20 years old when the telegram arrived in January 1945. In interviews decades later, she recalled, "He wrote about flying like it was breathing. He knew the risks, but he believed he could shape the way others survived. When he died, I thought of all the boys he must have saved. That was the only way to understand it." She accepted his Medal of Honor on his behalf in 1946, standing before rows of officers who had once flown under his command. In 1949, Fort Dix Army Air Base in New Jersey was renamed McGuire Air Force Base. Today, as part of Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, it stands as one of the largest military installations on the East Coast. Every transport aircraft, every tanker, and every C-17 that lifts off from its runways carries his name across the sky. Visitors to the base pass a simple plaque with his photograph and the words, "He flew as he lived, with discipline, courage, and loyalty." Thomas McGuire's story is not one of triumph without cost. It is the story of a young man, 24 years old, who carried the burden of doctrine and leadership into skies where death was measured in seconds. He became an ace through precision, but he died through instinct, choosing to protect a wingman even when mathematics and manuals said it was suicide. The Battle of Leyte was won, the Philippines campaign rolled forward, and the Japanese air arm crumbled. But for the men of the 431st Fighter Squadron, the war was forever marked by the absence of their major. In the words of one post-war historian, McGuire embodied the paradox of air combat in the Pacific, war fought by boys with machines too powerful for their age, measured by tallies too abstract for their humanity. His death was not just the loss of a pilot, but of a mind that believed discipline could turn survival into victory. And so the legacy of Major Thomas B. McGuire endures, not only in his 38 kills or in the airbase that bears his name, but in the doctrine of loyalty he left behind. No pilot flies alone. By the time the guns fell silent in August 1945, Major Thomas B. McGuire had been gone 7 months. The Philippines were secured, Iwo Jima taken, Okinawa bleeding under fire, and Japan reduced to ashes by B-29s and firebombs. When the atomic bombs fell, they ended a war already lost for Tokyo. In the post-war haze, as veterans boarded transports home and the airfields of Tacloban and Dulag dissolved back into jungle, McGuire's absence loomed larger than his presence ever had. He was frozen in time, a 24-year-old ace who never saw victory parades, never walked under ticker tape, never traded khakis for tailored suits. For the men who survived him, he was not just a memory, but a measuring stick. Even before the war ended, arguments erupted in newspapers and officers' clubs. Who was truly America's greatest ace? Was it Bong with his 40 victories? McGuire with 38? Or David McCampbell of the Navy with his epic carrier battles? The USAAF Victory Credits Board certified McGuire's total at 38, but veterans bristled at the tally sheet view. To them, his legacy was not in numbers, but in the methods he enforced. The tight defensive formations at Leyte, the insistence on wingman discipline, the calculations about fuel and altitude that meant survival. Years later, General George Kenney dismissed the debate with characteristic bluntness. Bong shot them down. Mac taught others how to fight. Without him, the losses in Leyte would have been far heavier. I count that as victory. The Battle of Leyte revealed the core truth of modern aerial warfare. Victory was not merely a duel of aces, but a system of logistics, doctrine, and industrial weight. McGuire's insistence on formation flying echoed into US Air Force manuals written after the war. His refusal to indulge in lone wolf glory mirrored the service's transition from individualistic air dueling toward structured air superiority doctrine. Post-war studies at the Air Force Historical Research Agency pointed to the Leyte campaign as a turning point. The 5th Air Force's ability to hold Tacloban's single pierced steel runway against raids, to fuel hundreds of sorties daily despite monsoon rains, and to coordinate P-38 sweeps across an archipelago of islands, foreshadowed Cold War concepts of rapid deployment and expeditionary air power. By 1946, as surplus P-38s were scrapped and the P-80 Shooting Star ushered in the jet age, McGuire's lessons were already codified. The jet fighter demanded even stricter discipline. Speeds doubled, engagements compressed into seconds, and radar control became as important as eyesight. The young captains who had flown under McGuire, men like Weaver and Rittmeyer, became instructors in the new Air Force. They carried his voice into the classrooms at Nellis and Randolph, telling cadets that altitude, energy, and teamwork outweighed instinctive maneuvering. In a sense, every contrail drawn in the skies of Korea or Vietnam carried an echo of Leyte. In 1962, at the US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo, former adversaries sat across polished tables. Among them were pilots who had once scrambled from Cebu and Clark to meet the P-38s of McGuire's squadron. When his name arose, the room grew still. Captain Takeo Tanemizu, who flew Zeros against McGuire's formations in 1944, spoke through an interpreter. "We could not understand why your formations held together so tightly. We thought it was cowardice, unwillingness to fight one-to-one. Only later we saw it was discipline. It made every attack costly. Many of us died trying to break those boxes of lightnings." The Japanese called the P-38 Nikoroku the two-tailed devil. They remembered McGuire not as an ace tally, but as the architect of those disciplined devils who frustrated every attempt to break the bomber streams. Back in the United States, Marilyn McGuire rebuilt her life quietly. She remarried, raised children, and rarely spoke publicly of her first husband. But each Memorial Day she visited his grave at Arlington. When asked decades later how she remembered him, she said simply, "As serious." He was never a boy. Even at 24, he was already carrying the weight of command. He died because he would not leave another man behind. That is who he was. In 1949, the Air Force dedicated McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. The ceremony was attended by generals, dignitaries, and veterans of the 475th Fighter Group. To the public, it was another name etched into the geography of post-war America, alongside bases for Mitchell, Travis, and Andrews. But for the men who had flown at Leyte, it was something more. Each C-124 Globemaster that lifted off those runways, each KC-135 that refueled bombers above the Atlantic, was a continuation of the doctrine McGuire had lived and died for, that air power meant projection, persistence, and protection of those beside you. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, a panel gathered to remember Leyte. Weaver spoke again of January 11, 1945, his voice unsteady even after 40 years. Others nodded silently, each carrying their own memories of rain-soaked runways, Japanese raids at dawn, and the thin figure of a major who had demanded they hold formation no matter the cost. One veteran concluded, "Mac's death taught us that courage alone isn't enough. It must be bound to discipline. That's what we carried into every war after, jets, missiles, even into space. He was the bridge." Historians later folded McGuire's story into a broader narrative, the triumph of American industry over Japanese scarcity, of logistics over valor. Yet within that grand arithmetic, his life stood as the reminder that war is fought by individuals with faces, voices, and choices. He was not the highest-scoring ace, nor the most charismatic, but he embodied the shift from romanticized duels to systematic warfare. His 38 victories were as much about protecting bombers and wingmen as about personal glory. In the museum at McGuire Air Force Base, a fragment of P-38 canopy sits beneath a portrait of the young major. The placard reads, "Major Thomas B. McGuire, 38 victories, Medal of Honor. He flew for discipline, for his men, and for a doctrine that endures. Visitors stop, read, and move on. But for those who know the history, the rain-drenched runways of Leyte, the crack of Browning .5s over the Visayas, the doomed plunge of a lightning over Negros, his story is more than a footnote. It is the echo of a voice that insisted no pilot fights alone, carried forward into every contrail that streaked the jet-age sky." On January 11, 1945, when Major Thomas McGuire's P-38 cartwheeled into a Negros hillside, the crash site was marked not only by twisted aluminum and shattered canopy glass, but by a cruel ledger. One of America's most skilled fighter tacticians was gone. His absence illustrated the truth that had governed the Pacific War from the beginning. Individual brilliance mattered, but it lived or died within the larger framework of logistics, production, and fuel. By then, Japan's air power had already entered its terminal decline. In Leyte and Luzon skies, American pilots increasingly faced not veterans of China or Rabaul, but raw cadets rushed from underfunded flight schools. Japanese combat diaries captured after the war confirmed that by late 1944, training hours had fallen to fewer than 100 per pilot. American P-38 and P-51 pilots arrived in theatre with 4 times that experience. The imbalance extended beyond skill. US records show that 5th Air Force alone was receiving 1.2 million gallons of aviation fuel per day by January 1945. By comparison, Japanese forces defending the Philippines often received less than 30,000 gallons per month for all air operations across Luzon and the Visayas. McGuire's unit could run training sorties between combat missions. Their opponents sometimes flew to battle on fuel siphoned from trucks and fishing boats. The P-38 Lightning itself was an engineering marvel, but also an industrial indulgence. Each aircraft required nearly 6,000 pounds of aluminum, 55,000 rivets, and 1,200 man-hours of labour. Lockheed's Burbank facility rolled them out at rates Japan could not fathom. By the time of Leyte, over 9,900 Lightnings had been produced. Japanese aircraft production, ravaged by bombing and raw material shortages, had already fallen into crisis. In 1944, Japan produced fewer than 28,000 aircraft of all types, many lacking radios, armour, or self-sealing fuel tanks. US factories, by contrast, produced 96,000 combat aircraft that same year. When McGuire's squadron lost a Lightning, a replacement often arrived within days from depots in New Guinea or the Marianas. Japanese squadrons, by contrast, sometimes grounded themselves for weeks awaiting new engines or spare parts. The tactical daring of Japanese aviators mattered little when measured against the industrial scale of American replenishment. The Leyte campaign revealed this imbalance in sharp relief. Tacloban's pierced steel plank runway, hammered into place in October 1944, was soon landing dozens of aircraft per hour. Each morning, lines of fuel trucks weighted with 100-octane gasoline shipped from Texas, refined in California, and carried across the Pacific in convoys. The Red Ball Express of the Pacific, a combination of Liberty ships, Seabees, and truck convoys, fed those strips with a regularity that astonished even American planners. Pilots like McGuire could plan multiple sorties a day, knowing that the logistical chain, from Midwestern oil fields to Leyte mud, would hold. Japanese diaries recorded disbelief. One officer in the 4th Air Group wrote bitterly in November 1944, "The Americans fly as if fuel grows from the ground. We measure by litres, they by oceans." McGuire's final mission illustrated the paradox. He dived into combat to protect a wingman, pressing his P-38 into a low-altitude manoeuvre the Lightning's heavy frame could not recover from. His courage was unquestionable, yet his death did not alter the course of the battle. Within days, the 5th Air Force replaced him with another experienced major. Within weeks, Leyte's skies were so dominated by American aircraft that Japanese formations often disintegrated before reaching targets. Historians later debated, had McGuire survived, could he have surpassed Bong's score? Could he have ended the war as America's greatest ace? The arithmetic of war offered a harsher answer. The outcome in the Philippines, and indeed the Pacific, hinged not on individual tallies, but on the inexhaustible supply of fuel, ammunition, and machines. The US Strategic Bombing Survey after the war quantified the imbalance starkly. In 1944 alone, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Japan refined 2.6 million barrels, barely a rounding error in the American total. Each month, US forces shipped more fuel into the Pacific than Japan refined in an entire year. This flood of petroleum powered an air campaign of overwhelming scale. In the Philippines, American fighters consumed more gasoline in 1 week than the entire Japanese 4th Air Army received in a month. McGuire's insistence on formation discipline, on conserving energy in combat, was rooted in tactical necessity. But the broader reality was that America could afford mistakes, even disasters, and still replace losses. Japan could not. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, Japanese and American pilots sat side by side. When McGuire's name arose, the Japanese veterans acknowledged his skill but also his environment. Captain Saburo Sakai, the famed Zero Ace, remarked quietly, "Your McGuire was brave, yes." But behind him stood factories without end. We fought with courage. You fought with courage and gasoline. That is why you won. American veterans nodded. They remembered the mud at Tacloban, the fuel drums stacked like pyramids, the Liberty ships offloading steel matting by the acre. They knew McGuire's brilliance had been framed within an industrial system so vast that even his death could not slow it. In the end, McGuire's story became less about the myth of the lone ace and more about the reality of industrial war. He was a symbol of daring, of discipline, of sacrifice. But he was not a saviour, nor could any individual be in a conflict decided by millions of barrels of oil and tens of thousands of aircraft. His fall on Negros marked the last gasp of the romantic vision of air combat, the knightly duel, the single decisive act. The war he fought belonged not to knights, but to factories, to convoys, to logistics officers with slide rules and requisition forms. At Leyte, the Pacific War reached its industrial climax. Airfields grew from swamp within weeks, fueled by gasoline hauled 7,000 miles, defended by fighters that rolled from assembly lines faster than Japan could imagine. McGuire entered that arena as one man with extraordinary talent. He left it as a reminder that in industrial war, individuals could be heroic, but the outcome was written in steel, oil, and numbers. His Medal of Honor citation praised his conspicuous gallantry. History adds another line. His death proved that even the bravest pilot could not tip the balance of a war already decided by oceans of fuel and mountains of production.